I'm Joan O'Doherty, Dr. Joan O'Doherty, but my specialism is the Common Fisheries Policy. But today I'm here not to speak as an academic, but out of my experiences of having grown up in Northern Ireland, lived for 25 years in southwest Donegal, and the latter part of my life has been spent in England. I saw my first dead body when I was 15 years old. It was my immediate neighbour, an elderly gentleman. In fact, it was Brian Freel's father-in-law. We were sort of mates. We'd walk up and down the park together, and he'd tell me stories, and we'd sit in his grandchildren's swing, him on one end, me on the other, whatever. And we'd have a Fox's glacier mint. Now, I can't remember my next body, who it belonged to, or what funerals I may have attended. But 10 years later, I was living in a place called Teelan in southwest Donegal. I don't know if any of you know of it. It's almost an island community. One road in, the same road out, and a community of 300 people. In Donegal, I got thrown into the death machine very quickly. The continual funerals, the wakes, and at first, I shunned them. My third child died aged 6 hours. I was still in hospital. I missed his funeral and refused to have people visit me when I returned home. I was having nothing, sorry if I touched something there. I was having nothing to do with their rituals, their nosy, intrusive rituals, as I viewed them. But over the years, that changed. I was with our immediate neighbour when he died in his 40s. I helped clean the house, prepare the food, stayed with the family through the next 48 hours of open house when everyone for over a 30-mile radius came to utter, "I'm sorry for your loss." I was involved in a similar capacity with the funerals of 4 uncles-in-law, a set of parents, and numerous neighbours. Every time, the rituals were the same. If a person died in hospital, usually at Letterkenny, which was over 60 miles away, then a group from the local community would drive to the hospital to give it the coffin an escort home. And along the way, at different points, you'd have at Ballybofey, Donegal, Killybegs, Kilcar, various cars then would join the cortege until they arrived home in Teelan. And when they arrived, the prayers would be said and the wake would begin. Tea, biscuits, sandwiches prepared by others in the community. Drink in our part of the world was only served to the men who stayed with the body overnight. And I have to say, in my personal capacity, I never witnessed drunkenness in the actual wake house. I was staying with one of my sons last night, and I spoke to him about this. And in all his years, because he would have been staying up, he was only involved in one drunken wake. So I thought that was interesting. Anyway, the priest would call to say the rosary. And all day and right through the night, people from all over would call with the usual, "Sorry for your loss," after they had stood for a few moments beside the coffin. The priest would call in the evening for the rosary again. And next day, he'd reappear, this time for the closing of the coffin, which was always, I found, the most harrowing period. And then the funeral procession to the church would take place and the funeral mass conducted. After, there'd be the cortege to the graveyard. Now in Carrick, the graveyard was immediately behind the church. But in the adjacent Kilcar, there'd be a half-mile walk down to where the graveyard was. And at the graveside, more prayers were said, often a decade of the rosary, before the final burial. The grave would have been dug the previous day by family members and friends, and filled in after the funeral by the same people. Later, there'd be a meal or soup or sandwiches before people would disperse. Sorry, I know I've been coughing this all day long in people's presentations. I've got a dose at the moment. Connell, a fisherman on my husband's boat, went overboard. He'd been married for 6 weeks and was an only son. I, with the priest, had to break the news to his father. His mother was dead many years. I then had to break it to his wife of 6 weeks, and later to his sisters and their families. He was a neighbour and friend. I sat with my mother-in-law as she left this world and was at hand when both my parents died. My sister and I washed my mother's body. Over the years, I grew to understand the Irish death customs, even if I did not embrace them. At my mother's funeral, it was celebrated with 14 priests and an assistant bishop. The local convent sang and the church was filled to capacity. My mother was not a particularly sociable person. She wasn't even from Derry, and she'd never belonged to a group or club in her life. So why the big attendance? In Ireland, the funeral is for those left behind, not for those who have died. When I returned to England, I've been at college there many years previous, I have to say I found it a relief not to be continually confronted by death. My first death experience in England was our immediate neighbour, a Hindu. My partner and I were the only white people at his funeral in a crematorium. I'd never been to a crematorium in my life. But it was a very gentle introduction to death in England because the Hindu community there have very similar rituals to those of the Irish. The funeral cortege left from his home and proceeded to the crematorium. Now, this is very unusual. At the crematorium, I learnt of the amazing life of my neighbour, how he'd been involved in politics in Uganda, how he'd had to flee when Idi Amin came to power, and his passion for cricket, which I already knew about because you've very thin walls in England, and he had their cricket on morning, noon and night. I've lived in England now for over 12 years. And in that time, in a personal capacity, I've attended considerably less than 10 funerals. In Donegal, I almost certainly would have attended that number every year. In our very small Donegal community, my sons, now in their 30s, have attended the funeral of 3 of their friends this year already. And suicide wasn't involved. My lifestyle in Birmingham does not permit me to offer my services as a volunteer. I cannot guarantee my attendance 1 day a week or even 1 day a month on a dependable, regular basis. So one day, I was reading the online Irish Times about willow coffins. And in the course of the article, civil celebrants were mentioned. And I thought, wait a minute, there might be something there for me. I'm no longer faced by death and dying, and the English appear to be. Maybe there is a role for me there somewhere. So I looked up the courses available. One had a lecture from Bath behind it, and I knew a friend's sister had done her PhD on death through Bath. So I made contact to check out the personnel and was reassured if X is anywhere involved, it's certainly worth doing. So I applied, did the preparatory test, writing skills, etc., got accepted, paid my money, attended a 3-4 day course, passed the written verbal sections, and became an accredited civil funeral celebrant. Because I view this as my community service, I don't advertise, I don't solicit, I don't go around the funeral directors, but somehow they've heard about me, and if they're hard up and they're pressed, and they're stuck for someone, they call on me. To date, I've done well over 40 funerals. Now, in England, when someone dies, like anywhere, there are legal obligations. First, one requires a death certificate. And that certificate has to be taken to the registrar within 5 days of the death. The registrar issues 2 documents: a certificate of death for social security purposes and a certificate of death for burial and cremation purposes, known as the green form. Now, arrangements cannot be made until one has this document in your hand. Now, most burials in England are by cremation. We already had the figure. It was over 70%, but you said in 2012 it was 74%. Although cremation was only made legal in Britain in 1885. And while there are variations on the theme, I'll outline what usually happens in England. After a person dies, an undertaker is notified, and he'll collect the body and hold the body while the family decide who will be the funeral director, not necessarily the person who collected the body. It's extremely rare for a body to return home in England. I've only had one such occasion, and that was 3 weeks ago, and that family had strong Belfast connections. After all the paperwork has been collated, and this can take quite a few days, decisions are made concerning the funeral. This is often weeks in advance and very, very rarely within the week. I've only had one occasion where a death happened on the Saturday and the funeral was the following Friday. That was extremely rare in a situation over there. All this time, the body is kept at the funeral home. And anyone who wishes to view the body has to give prior notice and be approved by the person paying for the funeral. Okay? If the person paying for the funeral has decided on a civil funeral, I'll be contacted and asked if I'm available and willing. Now, a civil funeral is different from a humanist in that religious prayers, symbols, and hymns are permitted if requested. I recently conducted a ceremony with Islamic, Buddhist, and Christian inputs. I then contact the family and make arrangements to visit them and to discuss the ceremony they wish for the deceased. I am responsible for the ceremony from the moment the coffin arrives at the crematorium until everyone leaves the crematorium chapel. When I meet the family, I get them to talk about the deceased. I encourage them to tell the good and the bad bits about the deceased, their favourite anecdotes, and encourage them as a group to reminisce. Only then will we discuss the service. We'll discuss the readings and the music. And I go away then and try and garner an image of this person and try and create a ceremony that I think will reflect the type of person they were, but also what the family want. Sometimes they can be two very different things. And most of what I will say, not all, because I think there needs to be little nuggets of surprises for the family, most of what I'll say will be double-checked with the family. I had one case of a young gay suicide, and the family were very strict that the fact he was gay and the fact it was a suicide were on no account to be mentioned. So anyone that was doing a tribute, I had to double check it, and I did, and there was one young girl, and she had both items in, and I had corrected her text and emphasised to her, and she stood up on the day, and out she came with everything. You know? So, you've only a certain amount of control. The ceremonies vary. Some are very sombre affairs, and some are quite light. I've had one with everyone wearing pink for a young gay funeral, and I had one red because the deceased was a very staunch Labour man. No two are ever the same. And as far as possible, I try and involve the family in the ceremony, doing readings, lighting candles, delivering the tributes, writing the tributes. I'm there to support them, and I will do as much or as little as they want. It varies depending on the families and their relationships. Some can be quite tense. I was once asked to have bouncers ready to eject a certain person if they turned up. But that I had to refuse, because contrary to opinions created by media, a funeral in England is a public affair, and nobody can be turned away. When the wine writer of the Times, Pamela Van Dyke Price, died recently, in her obituary it stated that she wrote down instructions for her funeral 20 years ago, including a list of those not invited. Meaningless and unenforceable, a funeral is a public event. Another time I conducted a ceremony for a BBC producer. Then I was merely the floor manager. The length and time allotted to a funeral service varies from local authority to local authority. In Birmingham, it is 30 minutes. In a neighbouring Worcestershire, it's 45. In Birmingham Crematoria, one is greeted with a notice. Ministers must ensure that they limit their service to 20 minutes. Failure to keep to the timetable may lead to a fine. 5 minutes is allotted to getting people in, 5 minutes to getting people out. If one wishes a longer service, they must purchase a double slot at double the price. In Birmingham, your 30-minute slot is £273. That's just for the chapel. The cremation is another £592. In England, in Birmingham at least, there are 20 minutes devoted to public acknowledgement of one's life, no matter how long or short your time has been on this earth. As I struggled with the intrusive invasion of one space when I landed in Donegal, so now I struggled with the lack of attention to dead in England. Their family members have often returned to work before the funeral. I find that strange. This is now the government legislation on it. Workers have a right to reasonable time off for an emergency involving a dependent. Blah, 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 blah. But the length and pay status of the time off depends on the employee's contract and the discretion of the employer. Typically, bereavement leave, also known as compassionate leave, is about 3 to 5 days. Over time, I began to understand the English more and their concern with the living. They view themselves as here and now and tend to deal with the here and now and not the maybes. They are pragmatic as opposed to principled. In Ireland, the family of the deceased becomes centre stage of their communities for a 3-day period. People travel from all over the world to attend the funeral. Families are surrounded by neighbours and friends, often friends they've not seen for a long time. I'm rushing because of the time. This is much less so in England. Usually only very close family members and friends attend. In England, the emphasis is getting back to normal life as soon as possible, and to that end there's less emphasis on the funeral and its trappings. I used to think that a big funeral was a sign of a life well lived. I remember attending a funeral of a man in Donegal, only 12 people in the church. He was a cantankerous old fella. And I thought at the time, how terribly sad. Now I think, I would like such a funeral. I'd like to slip away in such a way that everyone just got on with their lives. I know how I've lived. I know what I've done. I do not need other people to be reminded of my deeds or my foibles. I most certainly do not want people travelling from other parts of the globe to witness the final moments of my corpse or to reminisce about my life. Let them do it at some point during my lifetime if they wish, but let my passing be discreet. I heard a record over Christmas, and it really tells it for me as it is. And I'd like you just to listen to it. This is the end. And for the word Nashville, in your head, if you just substitute Ireland.